This is Roger Simon. I'm here with Lee Smith, who has just written and published a book which I sincerely believe may be the most important political book of our time, and that book is The Plot Against the President. If you have not bought a copy and started to read it or read it, do so as soon as possible. We're not going to talk a great deal about the book because I want everybody to read it and buy it. But let me talk a little bit ask you one question. And there was a phrase or the name of a group that I hadn't recognized, even though I'm one of those people who writes about this stuff too, before reading your book, and that's Objective Medusa. Can you tell us what Objective Medusa was and why that's important?
I'd be thrilled to. Well, first of all, Roger, nice to speak with you, and thank you for inviting me on to speak to your audience. And I always, as you know, get a huge kick and thrill out of speaking with you. Objective Medusa is the name of Congressman Devin Nunes' investigation of the investigators. At a certain point, Congressman Nunes' team, that's the subtitle of the book, the true story of how Congressman Devin Nunes uncovered the biggest political scandal in U.S. history. They were looking at first at these allegations of collusion. He's the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. They were looking at these allegations, and once they found that these things were not true, once they could find no evidence of them, they said, well, what happened here? There was an FBI investigation of candidate Trump. So surely something strange must have happened. And that's when Congressman Nunes and his staff, and I quote several of them, including the lead investigator, or one of the lead investigators, a gentleman named Kashyap Patel. And it was Mr. Patel who came up with the name for their work, for their investigation. He told Congressman Nunes, he said, look, this thing has so many heads, it's like Medusa. And what were so many things, we have to cut off the head, like the mythological figure Medusa. So that's what he decided to name it. He said, I decided to call it Objective Medusa. And so the book is in large part their story, the story of what Congressman Nunes, Mr. Patel, Congressman Nunes' communications director, Jack Langer, a gentleman named Damon Nelson, who was the staff director. Mr. Nelson died before they were able to complete the investigation. And it's a very moving story. It's a terrific story about a team, about what a team of a total of 8 people, what they did. And as Mr. Patel says in the first chapter, it's like without these 8 people, no one would have known what happened. So you were accustomed to saying, had Hillary Clinton won as had been expected, we never would have known what the FBI and Department of Justice and State Department and senior officials, at least one senior official at the Central Intelligence Agency, had done to the Trump campaign. It's not just that.
Let me ask you the question which is lurking in the minds of all of us and
Okay.
all the people who appear in the comment sections of blogs and when people like you write about this so eloquently and name names and give us all these facts, do you think that Barr and Durham will come through and they'll cut off those various snakes of Medusa? I mean, I think you could name, but I think the audience knows a lot of them.
Right. Well, Congressman Nunes issued 8 criminal referrals to the Department of Justice. So they have a very clear idea of what crimes were committed. I don't know the people whom they've referred to DOJ. I mean, Congressman Nunes nor anyone on the team ever told me, but we can look and see the different things that people did and get a pretty good sense of what some of those referrals might be about. So if the Objective Medusa team made criminal referrals, then that's certainly a general shape of an investigation that we imagine U.S. Attorney John Durham is looking at. So I imagine he's not he's looking at the same thing. I mean, again, it was Congressman Nunes was the first one out there with this. And actually, without him, as I was going to say before, without him, there is no investigation of the investigators. It was their team that did it and put it together. So I think one of the important things about the book is to get an idea how the operation shaped up in the minds of the people who made the criminal referrals and who saw it. So does that help answer the question here?
Yeah, I mean, it does. But we can only hold our.
Yeah, well, I'm confident that Mr. Barr, the Attorney General, and Mr. Durham, the investigator, or the prosecutor who is running this investigation, I'm confident that they see the different issues clearly. Not being a lawyer, not being a legal expert, I can't tell you whether they believe that all of these things will stick, but I know the important issues they're looking at, which is
yes. And so let's put on the hat of a prognosticator. Let's suppose that in the not too distant future, these indictments start to come down. What do you think the reaction of the country will be, and what do you think the reaction of the Democrats and the media will be?
Right. Well, I think that this is part of the reason right now for the impeachment push. I mean, I've assumed for many months, if not a year, that if there was going to be a serious investigation of what the FBI and DOJ did, CIA, State Department, of what different senior officials did, these would be spectacularly bad optics for the Democrats to be going into the 2020 election cycle. The idea that there were Clinton operatives and Obama officials, in other words, important parts of the Democratic Party apparatus. And if there were going to be indictments, it would be important to have something to push back or to at least some sort of countermeasure to obscure the picture. So that's how I see a lot of the impeachment movement right now. I think there are other people who will be. I think there are other people. I don't know how large it is. Maybe only 5% of the country, but I think there's a lot of people who have been in who don't really know. And I think that if there are indictments, that will be pretty convincing. I mean, these are real things. We say correctly, the victors write history. Most of the account right now is being written by the press, which is, as I argue and as I explain in my book, which is a part of which is in itself a political operation. So it will be very confusing for a lot of people if there are different indictments of the people who were involved in this. It will come as a great surprise to them. And however, the Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney will be very clear. I think that's one of the reasons they're going to be very careful with the different charges they're making and why they're going to be very thorough. So there doesn't appear to be a political witch hunt like the political witch hunt that targeted candidate, then President-elect, and then President Trump.
You know, speaking of which, one of the more interesting observations in your book, to me as a writer of this stuff, was the role of Fusion GPS. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I've known about it for a long time. But the way you phrased it was interesting, and I think it's open for discussion, which is that organizations that do opera research, like Fusion GPS, are really the investigative reporters of our time, and that creates tremendous corruption because, of course, they're not doing anything objectively. So it's sort of ruining the modern newspaper.
Yeah, I mean, the modern newspaper, I think, was ruined before the ascent of the opposition research firm. I mean, and so, again, I explain these in the book. Some of these things were uncontrollable, and some of them hit with both the force and with the chance of acts of God. The internet, no one really saw the internet coming. That was going to shake up the media ecosystem no matter what. Now, the way a lot of media executives responded to that was the problem. I mean, the New York Times, again, they waited or they deliberated for more than a decade about whether or not to charge for their products or whether or not to give it away for free. And just the fact that they deliberated over the value of their product is a big problem. So by the time that we got to 2015, the fall, and once Fusion GPS was hired to compile opposition research on the Trump team, we're already looking at an industry, opposition research, that is starting to, right, that had for several years had already taken the role, already taken the position of what a lot of other teams inside newspapers did. I mean, investigative teams are very expensive. Foreign bureaus are very expensive. So insofar as opposition research firms could cover some of these niches, they were very, very important. So coming into the 2016 election cycle, firms like Fusion GPS were already in the middle of the media ecosystem. They were in many ways it's the cornerstone of its new financial model.
That's effectively the engine of independent journalism. I mean, on one level, I mean, it's basically that.
Yeah. Well, the argument that I make is, I mean, these opposition research firms are paid by political interest groups to advance their interests. That's fine, right? To dig up dirt on your opponent. But if you're a newspaper, if you're a media organization, and you take someone's opposition research, you're putting yourself in the middle of someone else's political campaign, regardless of what side you're on. And this in large part, of course, the press didn't like Trump to begin with. But even had they not been so hostile to Trump, they would have been putting themselves in the middle of an anti-Trump operation by taking this material from Fusion GPS. So yes, the idea of independent journalism doesn't really exist, at least not in the prestige brands like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, the way it had up until relatively recently.
And who's going to pay for the research that is involved in, as you say, in investigative journalism, which often will take 6 months and yield nothing? So
I don't know who's going to pay for it, but I mean, I've found, and I've spoken about this a fair bit. One of the bright spots of what's happened here over the last several years, with all the problems we've seen in the press, is the number of independent researchers who've appeared on Twitter, and the amount of information that they can provide. These are people who know how to identify documents, locate documents, and read documents. So that tells me two things. It tells me, first of all, there are people who Americans still want real information. They want real news. Also, Americans are capable of providing and producing that information. So who will pay for it? What will a coming media ecosystem look like? I think that's still taking shape, but there are people who both want it and can provide it. So I'm very optimistic in that way.
That's great. Now, as a guy who's been inside these things for now almost 3 years since the election of Trump, what is it about Trump that you think so threatens him that, as being talked about all the time now, the Washington Post, had a headline on day one of Trump's presidency that the impeachment campaign began today.
Right.
What was it that so threatened them? Because, after all, he was just a real estate guy from New York that
Right.
a lot of them already knew.
Well, some of them knew. This is one of the problems, right? I mean, we're talking about a lot of people here. A lot of the people who've covered Trump are people younger people who've come to Washington. I grew up in New York City with Donald Trump's voice in my ears since I was a teenager, right? He started to become famous in the mid to late 70s. I can't imagine, or it's tough for me to imagine life without Donald Trump. So there are many different things to be said about Donald Trump. A number of people who dislike him for a number of reasons. But if you are from New York City and Donald Trump, like George Steinbrenner, like Rudolph Giuliani, if this is a center of your life, part of your life, you would have realized the whole idea that Donald Trump is a Russian spy, a Russian
It was comical.
I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's insane, right? It's like saying, well, George Steinbrenner, of course, was working for Beijing. I mean, it's that ridiculous. A lot of the younger people here in Washington, well, there are two things. First of all, they don't have a lot of experience of the world because they're younger. Second of all, the industry that they've joined, the media industry, is not what it was 15 years ago. They are political operatives. I think there are some people who are scared of Donald Trump. The people who are scared of Donald Trump are certainly people in what we would call, he calls it the swamp. I'm going to make it a little broader, what we would call the establishment. Because Donald Trump, he threatened lots of their prerogatives. He insulted the way that they'd run the world. So they didn't like him for those reasons. Now, are they really upset about the fact that he seems to them coarse in some ways, or he says some things that they don't think that they wouldn't say? Yeah, I guess, but I mean, that seems to me to be nonsense. There's a larger thing here. I mean, again, remember, Donald Trump was running on behalf of the country against the elite, right? This is a big thing. Trump called them out. They actually picked up the gauntlet and they said, okay, let's get it on. And this is what it looks like. I think, by the way, he was absolutely right to call them out for the way these people had mismanaged the country, a bipartisan mismanagement of America.
Indeed, and they really were mostly the same people.
Right.
Playing a rotation game. How would you define the elite? How would you characterize them? Who are they really?
I mean, we look at them in the press, we look at them in the academy, but of course here in Washington also, they fill many of our bureaucracies. But I mean, they hold. The reality is that every country, every society is going to have an elite that does certain kinds of work, whether they, you can go all the way back to the Egyptians and the importance of bureaucracies, the scribes, how to document certain things and how to keep and store these records. So we're always going to have people like that who do these things. What's important is how well educated these people are, how responsive they are. And by well educated, I mean, look, some of these people have tons and tons of degrees, but look at what's going on at places of higher education these days, right? I mean, things like gender studies, what does that teach you to do? What does that prepare you to do in the world?
Protest or teach gender studies. One of those.
Right. I mean, I'm sure there are many or some interesting ideas that are tossed around in courses like this, but to run a country, no, that does not prepare you for these different things. But it's not. I was thinking about this before we spoke. One of the cases I want to make is when we're talking about education and we're talking about common sense. So we've been talking lately about the Ukraine situation and how this has led to the impeachment inquiry. Well, one of the gentlemen involved in this is Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who is a subordinate on the NSC staff, and he is a specialist in Ukraine. But again, this is an Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel, and he believed that it was extremely dangerous for the United States. He was worried about U.S. government support for Ukraine. So if we're talking about the elite and if we're talking about common sense, this is a gentleman who apparently doesn't know how to read a map, and that's very bad. Because if we're talking about Army officers who don't know how to read maps, that's a bad thing. What I mean by that is Ukraine is a buffer state. Ukraine is a buffer state caught between a major power to the east, which is Russia, and Europe to the west. What is the vital interest in the United States supporting Ukraine? What is the vital interest in the United States sending arms to Russia's border. The idea that somehow it is in the American interest, no matter what, to support Ukraine appears to be a question that the Ukraine and Russia specialists across the Washington bureaucracy have never asked. Again, a lot of this comes down to looking at a real map, having some sort of sense of what the composition of the country is and what is in the vital interest of the United States. These are questions that have been fallen by the wayside over the last, let's say, quarter of a century, maybe more. Donald Trump is not a policy intellectual. He doesn't brag the way Barack Obama did, say, I know more about policy than my policy people. Donald Trump is a guy who appears to look at things pretty clearly and asks whether or not they make sense and asks whether or not they're foolish. So we're talking about the elite before. This is a man who they believe is coarse. This is a man who's written a best-selling book, but probably doesn't read that many books. This is a man that they believe is coarse, and he has called them out correctly as fools. So that's
you know who else didn't read a lot of books? This is a funny one, just to interject this. Henry James.
I believe it. Yeah.
Henry James is very famous for having said, I spend so much time writing, I don't have a chance to read.
Makes sense. I think his brother William, didn't his brother William have trouble reading Henry's books?
Yes.
I think he was not the biggest fan of his brother's books.
I shouldn't say it. Some of them I like. Anyway, well, this leads us to just a quick last thing on what do you think is going to come of next week's public Adam Schiff show, let's call it, with public testimony by Taylor and the others.
Well, I think it's going to. We have a pretty good idea of what they're saying. We have a pretty good idea of the kind of circus or freak parade, however you want to put it, what that's going to look like. And I saw, I guess it was K.T. McFarland, General Michael Flynn's former national security advisor, his former deputy, saying, I believe it was her who said this, if they're going to get into a reality TV contest with Donald Trump, they're really looking for trouble. And I think she has a point. Nonetheless, they're going to continue to push to use this to their advantage and tie down this president. And as you said before, they've been looking to impeach this president since before day one.
Before day one, yes. To wrap it up, that's very clear in your book. How far back before, actually, maybe a year, right before. Which is kind of amazing. I remember listening to Donald Trump on the Howard Stern show in the '90s in New York, when he was very pro-gay marriage and a lot of other things. Anyway, thinking this guy will never run for president. He's just joking around, but we were all wrong. But I'm glad he did, because I think we all learned something from it. I think what we learned, and I'd like you to comment on this thing, is that elites ain't so elite.
Right. Look, it's very impressive also because, Donald Trump has been around New York for a long time, and he shows up on Howard Stern. But as it turns out, while he was showing up on Howard Stern, while he was going to Harry Cipriani's or different parties around New York, he was also paying attention to something important. And I think that a lot of people have missed this. It's not just that Donald Trump has a good ear for what's on the ground or he knows how to speak to people. I think he was paying careful attention, and not just to trade, which the kind of thing that he would know pretty well, but in terms of foreign policy and just the general sense that Americans have of where the country is, where they feel let down or disappointed by their leaders. So it's almost a Prince Hal story. Here's a guy who's out and going to different parties, doing the different things, but apparently he was also studying very hard. He was also paying a lot of attention to what was really going on in the world. And I think, again, Donald Trump has never said he's a policy intellectual. I think he would probably take that as a kind of insult. But he has He has a clear picture of the world and what makes sense and what doesn't. And those things are tested against reality in the world. And one of the problems we've seen in Washington for quite a while is people keep testing things against reality, and nonetheless people keep going back to test the very same things against reality, and they fail again and again.
Well, thanks, Lee, for joining us. I mean, this was a hell of a great discussion, and maybe in a few months we'll do it again.
I look forward to it. It'll be great.
It'll be great to have you back after Durham and Barr have their say.
Well, again, we don't know when that will be wrapping up, but I mean, there are certainly a lot of people, a lot of Americans who are determined to, including Congressman Nunes, determined to have accountability for the bad things that were done. This is very important that there be accountability for the abuses and crimes committed in the investigation of the Trump campaign.
I'm going to end this where I started, which is buy Lee Smith's book. You won't regret it.
Thank you very much.
Because, history belongs to the people who read the most of it, too. It's not just, it's just not the Stalinists.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.